Hello again, I'm back. Okay, we're going to continue talking about the history of communication technologies. Last time we ended with this slide right here, so we're going to move right on. When we talk about print, the first thing we talk about is this guy, Johann Gutenberg, was a legitimate inventor of the movable type printing press. He did that around 1470 or so. And that was a huge revolution in mass media. It was the first time we could actually print things out. Everybody could look at them. Huge invention that people are still using today. Not so much a printing press, but print itself. And you're going to see this as we go through. Okay, let's take a look at some of the different types of print. We have newspapers, we have periodicals, we have books. Those are three main types. So let's look at each one of these as we talk about print. The printing industry itself, I should say, is the largest one in the world. The U.S. printing industry is the largest in the world. We first printed a newspaper in the United States in 1690 called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. Now today, we're faced with a situation where we have the largest newspapers are owned by the 10 largest newspaper owners, I should say, own 44% of all the newspapers. So we don't have a whole lot of ownership there. They buy all kinds of newspapers, and there's huge syndicates that own these newspapers. That's the way the ownership of the media is in the U.S. Currently, newspaper circulation, that is for hard copy, is down in the U.S. I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail in a second. First, though, let's talk about the growth. How did it get so big in the first place? Because it got really, really big. Now, the newspapers grew in size and number during the 19th century. Now, think about this. We had a newspaper in 1690. How many people in the colonies could read? They didn't have to go to school. See? So, one of the reasons that we had more in the 19th century was the literacy rate went up because we had mandatory school starting in the 1820s. And so more and more people could read. Up at that point, usually if anybody in the house could read, it was probably the mother. Because women were the ones that tended to learn how to read. Anyway, they had lower newspaper prices. Newspapers cost a penny or 2 pennies. And so that was, people could afford it. And they could also read now. So what the heck? Well, buy a newspaper. And so what the newspaper publishers did is they said, well, we're not going to make a lot of money selling the newspaper. We can put ads in the newspapers advocating positions or products or whatever, and we can make a lot of money. And that's what they did. They created the revenue model for advertising in newspapers, and the advertising then paid for most of the revenue, paid for most of the cost of running the newspaper. Worldwide now, the newspapers continue to grow, but in the U.S., the circulation is on a decline. Okay, let's figure this out, huh? Well, like I said, the U.S. print in general is on. Let's start with magazines. There's a picture there that you've probably recognize who that group is. I hope so. Very popular group. But let's look at magazines in general. First thing we talk about is the first one that was printed. That was by Daniel Defoe. The name may sound familiar to you because he also wrote Robinson Crusoe, the novel. He was a novelist, but he started a newspaper. In the U.S., we started around 1740, 1741. And of course, Benjamin Franklin was one of the first people who created magazine in the U.S. Now, I'm going to focus a little bit on the Saturday Evening Post because it was the first successful long-running magazine in U.S. history. It was targeted toward women. Now, later on, when it got more sophisticated and photography got more sophisticated, the Post had a tremendous amount of photographs in it, and they were really high-quality photographs. And the magazine, it was bigger. It had a bigger footprint than most magazines do today, and so the pictures were almost like watching TV in print. Now, it went from 1820 when it first started to about 1969, when it sort of died out. A lot of other things were going on in the country at the time. People kept trying to revive it, just never never got back after the 60s, just never made it back into broad circulation. Now, the audiences of the magazines are something that we need to look at because magazines have a really high mortality rate. It's very difficult to run a magazine, to create one, keep it running. Very hard to do. So you got to congratulate like USA Today and People Magazine and Time. Their longevity is pretty amazing. Okay. Now, here's what happens. Most readers are subscribers. They have a subscription for a year or so. We don't really buy them at the newsstand too much. In fact, it's hard in Louisville to find the newsstand. You have to go to a grocery store most of the time to find magazines. That's where I always see them. If I want to buy a magazine, I go to a grocery store, go to Kroger. It used to be a pretty good sized business, but still, even then, the revenue for the magazines was from the subscribers more than it was from the sales on the street. And 2/3 of their revenue, okay, came from those subscriptions. Okay. So most of the magazines were people who subscribed. I should point out one of the exceptions to this is trade magazines. They can last a lot longer because they're geared toward a very specific audience, plumbers or accountants or whatever your task is. So they have they have an easier time to exist because their articles are always relevant. Okay, so like I said, the current trend is decline. And here's why. New York Times found out that they realized years ago, hey, this is something's going to happen, online's going to take over, and they were ahead of the curve. And so they were able to create an online version. Washington Post did, all the newspapers did. San Jose, what was it, San Jose Post or whatever it was called? It was one of the first ones who did it back out in California. But it happens all over the world. I mean, I subscribe to The Guardian, which is in England, and I subscribe to the La Prensa, which is in Panama. So it's not just U.S. where you have online subscriptions, but the online subscriptions are taken off in the U.S. much more so than they are in other places in terms of replacing the hard copy. Now, you can still get a hard copy in New York Times, et cetera, but they don't have the near as many. And they used to have printing presses all over the country. They don't do that anymore. So the online distribution is the thing now, okay? This is just an example to show you. The only thing I want to show you here is the right-hand column to show you that the readership is down. That's, see the number goes down every year. So readership is down, and that's really the function of this. It shows you different ways that people watch things. And so they don't change that much. They haven't really changed, but what's happened in general is the readership is totally down. Okay, let's turn our attention to books. Okay, first book printed in English was printed in France, 1473. The Recueil of the Histories of Troy. Most of the books being published after the Gutenberg press, which was invented in 1470, so this was very soon after the press was invented. Most of the people were printing Bibles. However, Bibles were usually printed in Latin and not in English or Spanish or Portuguese or anything else. So they eventually were, of course, published in different languages, but initially it was mostly in Latin. Okay, first book published in the Western Hemisphere was supposedly published in Mexico City in 1539. Now, this is important to me because of the next thing I want to show you, which is the first book printed in the American colonies was in 1640. 100 years after Mexico printed a book. So anybody ever thinks that Latin America is behind in printing, they were ahead of us by 100 years. Ahead of, I say us, people that lived in the American colonies. Okay, now here's a really interesting phenomenon in the United States. 75,000 private book publishing establishments in the United States. 75,000. That means people who will publish books. A lot of churches publish books. A lot of people who just they have a business. They say, you want, and they know people they want to write books and get them published, but they're not good enough to get published by publishers, or they don't care to publish them by publishers. Somebody writes a family history and he wants to pass it out to the people in his family. He can go and get a book published at one of these private book publishers. There's one that right down the street from where I live. Now, legitimate publishing companies, there's about 3,000, which is still a lot. That's more than anybody else has. So we have a lot of printing outlets. We have a lot of places you can print. So I look at these trends. The number of books sold continues to rise. And we spend more money on books than anything except cable TV as a country. Average American spends about $100. That's really a deceiving, I think, statistic. It's accurate, but it's deceiving. If you're a student, how much did you spend on books? You might spend $1,000. So, but you're an exception. The average is $100 a year. Amazon reported in 2009 that they were getting more orders for ebooks than for paper versions, and that has continued since 2009. More people want to get ebooks. Now, every semester I ask, would you rather have an ebook or a hard copy? Invariably, they want a hard copy. I prefer an ebook because I don't want to lug 10 books around when I go on vacation. I want to take my iPad and have them on the iPad so I can read them whenever I want. But, to each his own. You can choose the way you want to. But you can put a lot more books on a device than you can carrying them around. However, there's something to be said for that feel of having that paper in your hand. Now, I should mention the self-publishing thing I mentioned last slide. The big growth is with women doing this. And you can see the 17% a year. So this is continuing. More and more people want to write their own little books. Okay, this is just a page that I stuck in here because it just gives you an idea that the readership is down even though the number of books being sold is up. Now, what that means is people who read books, and one of the things that we find is that people who read ebooks read more books. They tended to be people who read more in the first place, but with ebooks, they read even more. And part of the reason for that is so easy to get them. You can get a ebook in a matter of a minute or so. Once you order it, you have it right in your hand. So anyway, there's not real important except to see how readership, the number of people, this is a percentage of the people, U.S. adults, but the number of books is going up, even though the number of people reading may not be going up. Okay, that's the end of our discussion on print, so I'm going to stop here. And I will conclude our discussion on the history of technology next time when I do an overview of the history of the communication technologies. So we're going to stop here and we'll be back with number 3.